Okay, it's 7:30 and we're going to get started. Welcome to the February meeting of the Johnson Space Center Astronomical Society. I'm Doug Holland, president of JSC AS, and this is our agenda for this evening. For our main speaker tonight, we have Steve Flanders with the Palomar Observatory. The name of his talk is Building the Palomar Observatory 1928 to 1949. Then I'll have a member's minute about our JSC AS Star Party at the X-Bar Ranch is coming up in March. Then we'll wrap it up with Star Party News with David Haviland. During our meeting tonight, if you have questions for our presenters, you can email your questions to the email address shown at the bottom of the screen, jscaslive@gmail.com, or you can enter them in as a YouTube chat if you have an account that will allow you to do that. Now, for this particular presentation, for our main speaker tonight, we're going to hold all the questions to the end due to the nature of the presentation, and then Steve will address all those at the end of his presentation. And Trevor Quinn will be gathering up all these comments and questions and presenting those to Steve at the end of his talk. So before Steve starts, I'd like to tell you a little bit about him. In the late 1950s, Palomar Observatory was a place of great importance as Steve Flanders was getting interested in astronomy. Astronomy had been his avocation, and for 30 years, he worked in corporate IT management. Finally, in 2009, he completed a master's degree in the history of science at Harvard University and moved to Southern California. Mr. Flanders joined the observatory's docent program and after several years accepted the job of outreach coordinator. A Caltech employee for 8 years, his job involves overseeing the work of 36 volunteer docents who in normal times conduct tours of the Hale telescope, host star parties at their outreach center, and participate in a variety of special events at the observatory. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Steve Flanders with Building the Palomar Observatory 1928 to 1949.
Steve, you have a go.
Great. And Doug, thank you very much. Building Palomar Observatory, presented to the Johnson Space Center Astronomical Society. And it's a pleasure to be here tonight. It's a pleasure to meet everyone. Thank you for allowing me to join your meeting. And thank you for asking me to speak with you. The observatory is owned and operated by the California Institute of Technology and is funded by Caltech and its partner institutions. The Hale telescope was built with a $6 million grant obtained from the Rockefeller Foundation in 1928 by George Ellery Hale. Hale died in 1938, and when the telescope was dedicated in 1948, it was named in his honor. This is the 200-inch Hale telescope. Well, Hale was an astrophysicist and a solar astronomer. He is considered by many to be the founder of modern astrophysics. He invented the spectroheliograph, and he discovered that sunspots and solar prominences are caused, or at least are related to, magnetic disturbances near the sun's surface. And by the way, he was also a founder of Caltech. In fact, most famously, Hale also had a talent for getting money out of rich folks for big telescopes. Altogether, he built the largest telescope in the world 4 times. And in each case, he did it using other people's money, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and others. Hale's first 3 telescopes are pictured here. The Yerkes 40-inch refractor, completed in 1897, the 60-inch reflector at Mount Wilson in 1908, and the 100-inch Hooker telescope at Mount Wilson, completed in 1917. The 100-inch telescope was probably the most productive, most important scientific instrument of the first half of the 20th century. But having built these 3, Hale always wanted more light. He was always looking for the next larger telescope. In April 1928, Hale began a public campaign that he hoped would generate interest in his proposal for a new and bigger telescope. He told a simple story in this article in Harper's Magazine. He told his readers, "We are on a voyage of exploration and discovery, and transported by our great telescopes, we are venturing upon a universe vastly larger than anyone had supposed even a decade earlier. A larger telescope," he argues, "could effectively be used to extend the range of exploration into space." And in making that argument, Hale set out four objectives. It would be used, he said, to study and ultimately reveal the structure of the universe, the evolution of stars and galaxies, and the constitution of matter. In addition, this larger telescope would be used as a tool for the development of new research methods and new research instruments. The governors of the International Education Board of the Rockefeller Foundation found Hale's arguments to be compelling. In June 1928, they awarded $6 million to Caltech to fund the construction of a 200-inch astronomical reflecting telescope that would be, in the words of the grant, as complete and perfect as possible. Well, with that, the following month, the trustees of Caltech accepted the award, and in so doing, they put the Institute's considerable engineering resources at the service of George Hale's plan to build, as it turned out, his last great telescope. At the outset, Hale created, an administrative organization to manage the project. The Observatory Council was established as an executive body having authority over the work of nearly a dozen subcommittees. Hale chaired the council, and the solar laboratory on the Caltech campus became the council's meeting place and headquarters for the project. Design work, model building, planning, this essential part of the project had to be addressed first. They had to have plans. An important part of the design process, Russell Porter's elegant drawings served to provide context, and his work often facilitated communications within and between groups. But during this time, the telescope project was to a large extent on hold. Only one element of the project was being funded. Hale did not want to spend money on construction or other large, major capital projects until an issue of the greatest importance was resolved. Everyone knew that one component above all others would be the pacing element for the entire project. In fact, Hale and the other members of the Observatory Council faced a major problem with the 200-inch mirror. This was a problem of technology, and indeed, as suggested in this recent photo, the Hale telescope's 200-inch mirror began as a flat 20-ton glass disc. The council's problem in 1928 was that no one knew if it were possible to fabricate such a large and heavy disc. And for a variety of reasons, many people feared that it could never be done. Well, Corning steps in. See, after several failed mirror attempts, by General Electric Corporation. The job of creating the 200-inch disc fell to Corning Glass Works and to the company's chief scientist, George Macaulay. By 1931, opticians at Caltech and Mount Wilson had finalized the mirror's design so that upon receiving the contract from Caltech, Corning was immediately able to set up their manufacturing process. After several successful tests, Macaulay began preparations for pouring the 200-inch disc, and in this image from 1933, a frame to enclose the mold is nearing completion in the Corning factory. Why Corning? Well, Corning Corporation offered a range of consumer products, baby bottles, test tubes, and the like, made from their patented formulation of borosilicate glass. It was a product that the company copyrighted under the name Pyrex. Having a low coefficient of thermal expansion, Pyrex was attractive to the telescope builders because it does not change shape significantly as the temperature changes. Well, Caltech's design document specified that the back of the mirror would take the form of a honeycomb or ribbed structure. In the recent image on the right, this structure can be seen beneath the surface as a pattern of voids. On the left, a 1934 image of the mold shows how this structure was created. Ceramic plugs or cores were bolted to the bottom of the mold. The cores then would displace the molten glass as it was poured into the mold, and later, when the disc cooled, workers would chip out the cores, leaving the open spaces we see on the right. The cores, in fact, would displace more than 18 tons of glass. This weight reduction was essential. The telescope's mounting would have failed under the weight of a solid block of glass, and the voids would allow air to circulate, meaning that the mirror could reach ambient temperature more quickly. Well, with the mold created by late March 1934, construction of the mold was complete. And on the 25th of that month, Macaulay and his employees began filling it with molten glass. Corning invited the public into the factory to witness an event of national significance to many people then living through the Depression. Building the 200-inch telescope had come to represent an assertion of America's industrial competence and scientific leadership. And the work in the Corning factory attracted a great deal of attention because the fabrication of the 200-inch mirror was seen as an important step in building the 200-inch telescope. Important enough that Corning got a national correspondent, Lowell Thomas, to broadcast to the nation the events that were taking place on the floor of the factory in Corning, New York. And this is what it looked like. Starting at 7 a.m., workers began scooping 270-degree molten glass from the melting oven using ladles that moved on overhead tracks. Each ladle held 750 pounds of glass, and once filled, workers rolled the ladles to the mold where the glass was poured over the ceramic plugs. Each pour was followed by a refill at the melting oven, and so the process repeated until the plugs were covered to a depth of 6 inches or more, and the mold had reached its capacity of 20 tons of hot Pyrex. Well, Macaulay kept close watch on everything that was taking place. By late morning, the mold was filled, and as far as he or anyone else could tell, the operation appeared to have been a success. So much for that, because soon after lunch, first one, and then two, and then several of the ceramic cores became detached and floated to the surface of the glass. As would later become apparent, the hot glass had melted the steel bolts holding the ceramic plugs to the bottom of the mold. The 20-ton disc was ruined as the free floating plugs left deep scars in the disc's upper surface. In March 1934, this failure represented a catastrophic setback to the project. Needless to say, Corning Corporation was deeply and very publicly embarrassed. So embarrassed, in fact, that Corning put the ruined mirror blank in their Museum of Glass, where visitors now pay an admission fee to see it. Well, in the aftermath, Macaulay wisely placed the failed disc in the annealing oven, where it cooled slowly over several months. Examining the disc in early July, he understood two things. First, he realized that the cause of the failure, the melted anchor bolts, could easily be remedied. Second, he also realized that despite the issues with the cores, the failed disc was structurally sound. Solve the problem with the cores, Macaulay argued, and a successful 200-inch mirror blank could be poured on a second attempt. Well, the Observatory Council accepted this argument and approved a second pouring. Macaulay's technicians then set to work rebuilding the mold, this time attaching new ceramic cores to the bottom using hollow steel anchor bolts, as seen in this image. With fans positioned to circulate cool air, Macaulay was confident that the bolts could be kept cool enough to prevent a repeat of the earlier embarrassment. It was a Sunday morning. It was a second pouring. The mold was ready, and the melting oven was full of hot glass. A few Caltech officials joined a group of Corning's managers on the factory floor. No one else was invited, and no public announcements were made. Maybe the company reasoned everyone would be in church, and maybe no one would notice what was going on. They did it in secret. Well, again, Macaulay kept watch as the mold was filled. When 20 tons had been labeled into the mold and no problems had been encountered, Macaulay quickly began the annealing process, a regulated program of slow cooling that would prevent stresses from building up in the glass. And after 10 months of cooling, Macaulay removed the disc from the oven, carefully examined it for cracks and deformations, and judged it a success. Everyone in the Observatory Council was relieved and gratified when, in short order, experts from Caltech and Mount Wilson concurred with Macaulay's assessment. And this is a good image. It provides a perspective on the size and structure of the mirror. Macaulay is on the left, and when this picture was taken, the disc was being prepared for shipment to Pasadena. So 2 years after that first pouring, Corning, New York, March 25th, 1936, Corning placed the disc in a protective steel container and drove it from the factory across town to the railway yard, where it was raised to an upright position and placed on a freight car, specially built for the purpose by the New York Central Railroad. The following day, with its container painted white and adorned with a bit of advertising, the disc started off on a 16-day rail journey to Caltech's optical lab in Pasadena. Moving at 25 miles an hour, stopping every night, the train traveled a route that had been carefully chosen to avoid low bridges and overpasses. As with the first pouring at the Corning factory, the rail journey also marked a major cultural event. In towns and cities along the way, schools were dismissed so that students could go down to the railroad right-of-way to see the train as it passed, carrying its unique and historic cargo. And finally, the train approached the rail yards in East Pasadena on April 10th, 1936. The disc in its container was unloaded from the rail car and driven into the optical laboratory. It arrived at the optical lab April 10th, 1936, and this is the crew of Caltech's optical lab, under the direction of Chief Optician Marcus Brown. They will spend the next several years grinding, figuring, and polishing Corning's 200-inch Pyrex mirror blank. Their job will be to transform this flat piece of glass into an f3.3 astronomical mirror, having a paraboloidal curve accurate to within 1/millionth of an inch. The observatory council thought the job would take 5 or 6 years to complete. That's foreshadowing. Little did they know. In the spring of 1936, as work on the mirror was starting, progress was also being made on other elements of the telescope project. Work that was enabled by an event that had taken place in September 1934. Oop, I skipped one. There we go. High atop Palomar Mountain. In the summer of 1934, Macaulay examined the failed disc and judged it to be structurally sound despite problems with the cores. This pronouncement made it clear that Corning possessed the skills and technology required to produce an accurate 200-inch Pyrex disc. With this, Hale's earlier concerns were resolved, and the Observatory Council began allocating funds to other capital projects. Construction was now a central issue. Planners and engineers needed land on which to build, and within 2 months of Macaulay's declarations regarding the disc, Caltech began purchasing land for the observatory on Palomar Mountain. From the beginning, finding a site for the telescope had been a matter of great importance. As he set up the project's administrative structure in 1928, Hale established a site selection committee subordinate to the Observatory Council. This group moved quickly to identify a half dozen or more mountain locations where conditions of weather and of seeing might be suitable. Before the end of the year, the site committee hired Caltech graduate students and a few local residents to take meteorological readings and evaluate seeing quality at sites in Southern California and Arizona. To take seeing measurements that could be compared across sites, the observers were issued identical 4-inch refractors like the one above. Excuse me. Well, only a few especially interesting and attractive sites were selected for examination and measurements by local residents. Only a few places had local residents taking daily readings throughout the year. One of these sites was on a plateau located at the 5,600 foot level on the western shoulder of Palomar Mountain. A rancher and local landowner named William Beach was hired to do the work. He will enter this story again, but here we should note that with his stepbrother, Beach owned most of the high plateau on which Caltech chose to conduct these seeing tests. Excuse me. Beach made readings and kept meteorological records continuously from the fall of 1928 until mid-year 1934. Why Palomar Mountain? Why was it of interest, and why was it ultimately chosen? Well, many considerations were involved. Seeing conditions were good, although not quite as good as at Mount Wilson. It was a dark location, perhaps as dark a place as any in the region. The mountain was less than a day's drive from the offices and labs in Pasadena. And other issues aside, George Ellery Hale seems to have liked Palomar Mountain. Of course, Beach's high flat plateau, seen here in winter before construction began, was also important. A large campus with extensive facilities could be constructed here. And for all these reasons, the site selection committee from an early date was interested in this location. And as it happened, also from an early date, Beach made it clear his interest in negotiating a sales agreement. Well, with the principals positioned to reach a deal in this way, in late August 1934, the Observatory Council authorized Caltech's lawyers to begin making land purchases on the mountain. A meeting was held in Bill Beach's cabin on September 22nd. He and several other landowners met with representatives from Caltech, County of San Diego, and the Cleveland National Forest. During that evening, agreements were signed that transferred ownership of 200 acres to Caltech, 120 of these from the Beach brothers, 40 of these from the Cleveland National Forest, and a further 40 acres from 2 other landowners. Additional purchases would be made in coming years. Well, yet for several months, the land deal had been in jeopardy. However well suited Palomar Mountain might have seemed to many, the Observatory Council was nonetheless hesitant because there were no roads to the site sufficient to support the expected weight and volume of traffic, as suggested in this photograph. The council's argument was clear. Someday a truck will arrive from Pasadena carrying the 15-ton mirror. If that truck cannot reach the site chosen for the observatory, then the telescope cannot be built on the mountain. This contemporary image suggests what the roads on the mountain were like in 1934. Fortunately, the Board of Supervisors of the County of San Diego stepped in during the negotiations. The board members believed that, by association, the county would gain a measure of prestige if the telescope were located on Palomar Mountain. As a result, the supervisors agreed to build, at taxpayers' expense, a hard-packed gravel road to the plateau. After the county's representatives signed the necessary papers at the meeting on September 22nd, work on the new road started slowly. It was delayed at first when local landowners challenged its proposed route, and then delayed further when the county ran out of money. Finally, almost 2 years into the agreement, the California Department of Highways stepped in. Canfield Road was completed by the state in June 1937, and with its opening, the highway to the stars ran all the way to the observatory on Palomar Mountain. Well, workers arrived on the plateau soon after the agreements were signed, and clearing and leveling operations began in the summer of 1935. When this image was taken a year later, on June 30th, 1936, William Beach's high pasture was being transformed. A workers' tent city is seen in the foreground, with temporary administrative buildings, the lower left, and more permanent structures, including a water tower at center left. The light colored patch of ground at center right marks the location on which they will build the dome for the 200-inch telescope. Well, and the observatory needed basically all the facilities of a small town. Roads were built and graded. A central administrative building was constructed to provide space for offices and for a variety of maintenance and utility functions. Wells were dug and pipes were laid to the water tower, to the dome, and to cottages that were being built to house the permanent staff. Palomar Mountain had no connection to the electric utilities in the region. Therefore, 3 massive Enterprise diesel engines were installed in the administrative building to supply power to the campus, an arrangement that continued through the end of the 1950s. On June 30th, 1936, footings for the foundation of the dome were in place, and this is that light-colored patch of ground that we saw in the earlier slide. In the center of that circle, with footings in position, the telescope's massive base frame was erected. Seen here on September 28, 1936, this structure provides the foundation on which the 530-ton telescope rests. Isolated from the dome, piers descend from the corners of this frame down 22 feet into the bedrock of the mountain. So far, the Hale telescope has suffered no damage as a result of seismic activity. Well, with that frame in place, went too far. There we go. Construction soon began on the walls of the dome. The work proceeded rapidly, and its steel frame was complete late in the summer of 1937. So that the dome would be able to rotate, steel rails were installed on top of the walls. Consolidated Steel Corporation of Los Angeles received the contract to build the dome. They first installed 32 four-wheeled trucks on the rails and then assembled the dome on top of the trucks. Here, the dome's central arch is nearing completion. This is an essential component. The arch will carry the 60-ton crane needed to move heavy parts from ground level up to the observing floor. And while all this was going on, two other facilities were in progress. As the dome of the 200-inch telescope was rising, work was proceeding on buildings that would house 2 additional telescopes. The one on the left, a building to house the 18-inch Schmidt telescope, is under construction in the summer of 1936. In the image on the right, from late 1939, cranes are moving temporary spanning beams in preparation for the assembly of a dome that will enclose the 48-inch Schmidt telescope. Now, the 48-inch telescope did not go into service, until after World War II, but science operations on the 18-inch Schmidt began in the fall of 1936. For many years, Fritz searched for a supernova, made photographic surveys. In 1993, Carolyn Shoemaker used the telescope to discover comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 several months before it crashed into Jupiter. This telescope was decommissioned in 1999 and is now on display in the observatory's museum. So, with all that moving along, in the spring of 1938, workers were preparing in this photo to install the shutters on the dome of the 200-inch telescope. With the shutters in place, the dome would then be fully enclosed. So in anticipation of that milestone, the crew from Consolidated Steel took a moment to record a group portrait. And by early fall of 1938, the walls and the dome were complete, as were many of the observatory's ancillary structures. The grounds had been prepared, and at last, the dome was ready to receive the 200-inch telescope, which, as it turned out, the telescope and its mounting were by then nearing completion at a factory in South Philadelphia. The Observatory Council had been working with Westinghouse Corporation since January 1936. A contract was signed later that year, and here the people who were building the telescope stand in the ring that will tie the truss members together at the lower end of the tube. One factor was dominant in Caltech's decision to have Westinghouse Corporation fabricate the structure of the telescope. Many of its parts would be large, and apparently Westinghouse was the only domestic firm that possessed hydraulic presses large enough for the job. In this image from the fall of 1936, the lower truss ring from the previous slide is being forged in a press in the South Philadelphia factory. Westinghouse boasted about the immense scale of the work by publishing images such as this. Seen on July 8th, 1938, the telescope's east and west support arms are joined to the yoke bearing at the south end. And even now, the scale is impressive. Here, workers stand on the split ring bearing, also called the horseshoe bearing, that will be attached to the north end of the yoke. Westinghouse assembled parts of the telescope in the factory to make sure everything was aligned and fit properly. Well, fabrication of the yoke and other parts of the equatorial mounting continued for some time after the tube was completed in April 1937. To celebrate their success in building the tube, Westinghouse held a dedication ceremony in the factory on April 30th. Among the invited dignitaries, the presence of one guest in particular drew the crowd's attention. Albert Einstein attended the dedication, and you can see him sitting there. As far as we know, this event represents his only involvement in the 200-inch telescope project. Well, as the manufacturing process moved along, Westinghouse began moving parts from the factory down to ships waiting at docks in the Delaware River. Here, the prime focus ring, which ties the truss members together at the top of the telescope, is seen in late 1938 as it is being moved to the docks. Well, all the parts were loaded in the ships, and they sailed at intervals down the East Coast, through the Panama Canal, and then north to the port of San Diego. Here, a section of the horseshoe bearing is lifted from the hold of a freighter named the American Robin and secured to a trailer for the trip to Palomar Mountain. The new road, Canfield Road, was opened by the time most of the parts of the telescope began arriving. In this image, two tractors are linked together to haul a section of the horseshoe bearing to the observatory. One of the tractors has broken down under the heavy load on the steep road. And as they reached the observatory, these parts were staged at the road junction on the west side of the dome. Here, the prime focus ring is about to be moved into the dome on the ground floor. There we go. Okay. Then, in the order required for assembly, parts were raised from the ground level to the observing floor. Here, the prime focus ring and the lower truss ring are seen on the left, while a section of the horseshoe bearing is being raised through the hatch. Well, this image was taken January 6th, 1939, and the west arm of the yoke rests on a temporary scaffold as the east arm is being raised into position. On February 17th, 1939, the yoke itself is complete. The telescope's tube will be installed between the arms. The tube will turn on bearings in the arms, while hydrostatic oil bearings in the horseshoe to the north and in the yoke to the south will allow the 530-ton structure to turn almost frictionlessly in right ascension. By mid-April 1939, the truss tube is in place, lacking only the prime focus ring at the top. In this image, the massive structure of the telescope contrasts with a person seen standing in the tube at the top of the pivot box. And at the end of the year, the building and the dome are complete, as also is the structure of the telescope inside. Even so, a great deal of work remained to be done, and over the next several years, engineers will spend long hours and many days installing and adjusting the telescope's control and tracking systems. Well, with that structure in place, back to the optical shop, April 1936 to November 1947. And here, Marcus Brown and his team of opticians began work on the mirror in April 1936. They used a grinding machine in the optical lab to grind and polish the mirror's paraboloidal curve. Driven in circular motions around the disc, this grinding tool did the heavy work of removing 5.5 tons of Pyrex. At the end of 1939, the work had gone well, and the crew of the optical lab could see that a nearly perfect curve was forming on the upper surface of the mirror. Well, things went so well, in fact, that just 18 months later, in the summer of 1941, Marcus Brown stopped the work to assess the mirror's figure. The knife edge test showed excellent results. He was proud to tell his employees that they had successfully shaped the surface to within a first-order approximation of a perfect paraboloid. Everything was on schedule, and the end was in sight. Unfortunately, Brown was unable to account for one looming factor. World War II interrupted his plans, as it also interrupted the plans of many others. The mirror project was put on hold at the end of December 1941, and work did not resume until December 1945. And by then, few of Brown's original crew remained. To finish the job, he had to rebuild his organization and train a new crew. Well, he made good progress with that as well. And less than 2 years later, the job was complete, or it was considered complete. During September 1947, the Observatory Council judged that the accuracy of the mirror's figure exceeded design specifications. The mirror was done as complete and perfect as possible. Marcus Brown was well satisfied with what his crew had accomplished, and to commemorate, he scratched his name into the glass at the edge of the Cassia grain opening. Then everyone helped prepare the mirror for its journey to Palomar Mountain. Well, the journey to the mountain began on the morning of November 18th, 1947, when the mirror left the optical lab in Pasadena, pulled by a 22-wheeled tractor trailer owned by the Leah Truck Company. The mirror and its mounting cell and its packing crate weighed nearly 30 tons. 11 years and 7 months had elapsed since Corning's 200-inch Pyrex disc arrived at Caltech's optical lab. During that time, Brown's crew had used 41 tons of rouge, an abrasive compound, and had spent 180,000 working hours grinding and polishing the glass. Now, as it left the optical lab, the truck carrying the finished mirror turned east on California Street before heading south to join Highway 101 and later the Coast Highway. Well, accompanied by carrying Caltech officials and reporters, the truck carrying the mirror stopped sometime after 11 a.m. at the Gallivan overhead on Highway 101. The overhead was a bridge that spanned the tracks of the Santa Fe Railroad at a 50-foot ravine. it was necessary to bolt 18 specially constructed two-wheel dollies to the trailer to move it more safely and distribute the load. The operation required more than an hour to complete. Even so, the caravan drove past Mission San Juan Capistrano and reached the coast highway by 12:30 p.m. The pace then quickened on the coast highway. At 2:30 p.m., the mirror passed through Camp Pendleton, seen here with the Marine barracks in the background. Continuing south, the long line of trucks and cars turned inland when they reached the junction with State Route 78 in the city of Carlsbad. 20 miles remained before they reached Escondido, their stopping point for the night. At 5 p.m., Belea's tractor and trailer parked for the night at a hotel in Escondido. They had traveled 124 miles that day. Guards stood watch over the mirror as the drivers and their passengers got a night's rest. Escondido lies 37 miles by road from the observatory. The journey resumed next morning when the vehicles left the hotel at 5:15 a.m. In this image, Byron Hill, construction supervisor and the first superintendent of the observatory, stands on top of the mirror crate. As seen here, driver Lloyd Green has stopped the lead truck in Valley Center to allow Belay employees to perform mechanical checks prior to beginning the ascent of the mountain. Here, the tractors are near the start of South Grade Road. It is 12 miles and a 4,600-foot climb from here to the observatory. Hill stood on top of the box for the entire journey, and he had reason for doing so. With one truck pulling and two trucks pushing, Hill coordinated the work of the three drivers, and in particular, he shouted instructions to them so that they would all shift at the same time. Though a warm fall day had been predicted, the drivers met wet, cold, and icy conditions as they began the climb up the mountain. Even so, the drivers arrived at the dome before 11 a.m. and bettered the scheduled time by almost 3 hours. You get a lot of weather like that up here that time of year. The lead truck, the driver, Lloyd Green, backed the mirror through the big doors on the west side of the dome, where it was later unpacked and lifted to the observing floor. With the mirror safely in the dome, the journey came to its end, 164 miles from the optical lab on Pasadena's California Boulevard. The trip was made in 17 hours and 17 minutes driving time at an average speed of 9.3 miles per hour. Well, Marcus Brown did not follow the mirror to Palomar. His job was done. And in his place, Don Hendricks, chief optician at Mount Wilson Observatory, stepped in to oversee the remaining work. Soon after the mirror arrived on the observing floor, he applied a coating of reflective aluminum to its upper surface, mounted it in the telescope, and began running tests. Unfortunately, the fabrication and shaping of the glass had not gone quite as planned. The mirror did not sag at its edges as had been predicted. Its edges were too high, and almost 2 years of work would be required to bring them down. But two important things happened during those 2 years. First, Caltech held a dedication ceremony on June 3rd, 1948. That day, hundreds of invited guests sat under the telescope to hear Caltech President Lee DeBridge announce that this powerful new instrument of science would be named the Hale telescope. George Ellery Hale had passed away 10 years earlier. He never saw his greatest accomplishment. But second important event happened a couple of months later. In September 1948, science operations began on the 48-inch Schmidt wide field telescope. This instrument was built to conduct surveys and to create a catalog of faint objects for, excuse me, the 200-inch telescope to examine in detail. Currently, this telescope, now named the 48-inch Samuel Ocean Telescope, is involved in an automated transient survey program. This image from 1950 shows Edwin Hubble as he applies tracking corrections during an exposure. Well, during the 2 years, Hendrix's opticians worked by tiny increments using methods that required great precision and exacting skill, and also required limitless amounts of time. To the credit, their tests showed slow improvement in the accuracy of the mirror's surface. But the impatience of the astronomers overwhelmed the careful craftsmanship of the opticians. Of course, some influential people were waiting to use the telescope. As Hendrix persisted, it soon became apparent that the surface was so accurate that the disk's theoretical resolution was greater than the best seeing conditions on the mountain would support. At this point, Edwin Hubble, seen here in the prime focus gauge, demanded that the telescope be turned over to the astronomers. It was a call that the administrators at Caltech and at Mount Wilson could not ignore. On the evening of January 26, 1949, Hubble was given the honor of taking what is considered to be the Hale telescope's first light image. He made a 15-minute exposure of NGC 2216, an object also known as Hubble's variable nebula. He expressed his satisfaction with the result, commenting only that seeing conditions had been less than ideal. Well, yet that image wasn't the beginning. Even so, work remained to be done before science operations could begin. Through the summer of 1949, balance and tracking problems were solved. A major issue with the mirror supports was fixed, and performance was improved in many areas. Finally, after 2 nights of tests, Ira Bowen, director of Palomar and Mount Wilson observatories, declared that science operations would begin on November 13th, 1949. Milton Humason, Hubble's assistant at Mount Wilson, was the first astronomer to use the 200-inch Hale telescope. And science programs began with Humason's observations that evening in November 1949. And the Hale telescope has remained in service ever since. This instrument now supports the work of professional astronomers on average 300 nights a year, and it has been doing so for 72 years. So with that, George Ellery Hale's motto: make no small plans, dream no small dreams. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. We do have some questions.
Sure. Happy to.
The first one, let's see, where did it go? What did they use to chisel out the ceramics that made the voids so as not to break the glass?
What did they use? I don't really know, but from what I've been able to gather, the ceramics were pretty brittle, right?
Okay.
Didn't take much to dislodge them. You get part of them out, and the rest just, took the pressure off, and the whole thing came out. I don't understand. My understanding is that was not a major issue in this process.
Okay. Thank you. Next, does Caltech still have an optics lab that figures telescope mirrors?
No, because the optical lab that we saw a couple of pictures of there, that was dismantled a couple of years after the telescope was done. Caltech is not in that business anymore.
Okay.
I'm sorry to say.
What all professional telescopes are currently in operation at the Palomar Observatory?
That's it. Well, there are 3 telescopes operating in the at optical wavelengths that are really critical to what we do. There's the 48-inch Samuel Ocean telescope. That was the one used for the two Palomar sky surveys. We have a 60-inch telescope, and then the 200-inch telescope, and those 3 work together. The 48-inch photographs the visible sky, does it robotically, photographs the entire visible sky once every 3 nights, the band of the Milky Way twice a night, makes a huge photometric database that is used to find transient objects, is even used to do light curves. And building up this database is an important part of what we do, and it is going to be part of the support that will help the Vera Rubin Observatory when it goes online. In addition to those 3, we also have, 2 smaller telescopes that operate in the near infrared and also do robotic surveys. These are, as I understand it, some of the first surveys that have ever been done in the near infrared. And they too are used to build up databases of transient objects, find things that haven't been seen before. There are other things coming in. We are two telescopes are being installed right now that together are called panoseti, and these will look for evidences of extraterrestrial intelligence, look for signals at optical wavelengths. And this is being funded by one of the people who founded Qualcomm.
Okay.
It has seemed like an interesting project to me.
All right. The next one's kind of a 2-parter. What were some of the major discoveries made by the 200-inch telescope, and is it still being used for research?
Well, certainly, yes, it very much is. The observing the observing schedule can be seen on the Palomar website. There are professional astronomers using the Hale telescope. Well, they are assigned to the Hale telescope. They are assigned time 363 nights a year. We get more requests for observing time on the Hale telescope than we got nights to give out. So we always got a backlog. It's still in demand. And the range of things going on kind of covers the spectrum right now. A lot of exoplanet follow-ups. A lot of studies of intergalactic medium, quasars and AGNs, and some studies as well of the outer solar system. One astronomer is doing weather surveys of Titan and Triton. All kinds of things like that going on the 200. And of course, the other telescopes are doing robotic surveys, and they keep cranking out gigabytes of data every night.
All right, thank you. One more question.
Yep.
Did George Richie play a role in the design or production of the Hale telescope?
Simple answer is yes. He was part of the staff at Mount Wilson Observatory. In fact, he had been hired at Mount Wilson by George Ellery Hale, who was the first director of Mount Wilson. As it turns out, Richie and Hale had something of a, disagreement, perhaps a falling out. Richie wanted Hale to use Richie's design, optical design for the telescope. And Hale didn't think that Richie's design was quite, if you will, it wasn't ready for prime time. And they had a falling out about that. That's what I understand Richie's involvement in this project was. Other things?
I think that's it. Thank you again, and I'm going to turn it back over to Doug.
Thank you.
Doug, you have a go? But your presentation's not up.
Yeah, Trevor, believe it or not, there's something going on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Do you hear me?
I can. Yeah, my computer's decided to go crazy. So what I'm going to do is I'm assuming you can still see David's presentation. Is that right?
David's is there. Yeah, I can switch to his.
Okay. All right. Very good. Oh,
wait, there's yours.
I just got it back. It's one of those great mysteries we don't know. Okay, I'm back in business. Okay, so sorry about the interruption, folks. Steve, thank you very much for that presentation, and that is just an incredible story of achievement. So that is just something. Thank you very much for bringing that to us. Okay, so next up, I have a members minute. Just a reminder to everybody about our JSC Star Party at the X-Bar Ranch. It's a reminder that March 26th through Wednesday, March 30th, we're all going to go out to the X-Bar Ranch and then move from there to Fort McCavitt from March 31st through April 2nd for extended star party in dark sky areas. That's Bortle skies, Bortle 2 skies. Bortle 1 is the theoretical maximum darkness, so Bortle 2 is pretty good. X-Bar Ranch is about 58 miles west of Fort McCavitt, and it's used for the El Dorado star parties. Many of us have gone out to that. So we're doing this as a club. This is the first time we've ever done this. We've done Fort McCavitt, of course, many times, but we're going to try to combine X-Bar before that to make it a longer star party. And I hope you guys can join us. If you want to get reservations, the web page at the bottom, www.xbarranch.com. They have cabins, RV sites, and if you get a cabin, you can use the lodge and the kitchen. It's actually a very nice facility. All the cabins have bathrooms and showers, which is a lot better than sleeping in a tent, which is what I normally do. You got to bring all your own food and water. Water is available. You got to bring out your own food. There's electricity out on the observing field. So I think last time I checked, we have 8 members of our club going. The X-Bar can accommodate more than that. So I hope some more of you will decide to come with us and have a great time out in the dark sky site and have some good time out doing some astronomy together. All right, next up we have David with Star Party News.
David, you have a go.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. That was really cool to see the history of Palomar. All right. Star Party news for February. There has actually been nothing since January, so it's going to be a real short one. Here on the 4th of March, we have our first event at the Hack Winery. It'll only be a 5% moon in the deep western sky, so it's going to be a DSO night. So hopefully, if it's nice and crystal clear, we'll be able to show people the Orion Nebula, among a few other things. And that runs 6 to 10 that night. On March 12th, literally as of today, hot off the press, we kind of got this firmed up. South Shore Harbor, Magnolia Creek Golf Course. I understand those are two different locations. I'm going to be firming that up. I think it's going to be at Magnolia Creek. We're going to be meeting with the guy a couple of Saturdays from now. We've revised the time from 6 to 8:30 since right now he's not projecting any more than about 35 people. It could balloon up to about 60 to 70 depending. There's going to be a 71% moon that's going to transit at 8:30, 8:34. And this will be an interesting outreach event to try. There's a second date possibly in the works if depending on how well this one goes. March 26th through March 30th, Doug just mentioned this, is at X-Bar Ranch, and then 31st through April 3rd is at Fort McCavett. We have 5 more dates to get on the calendar that are under discussion with the Hack Winery and with Magnolia Creek Golf Course. That's all that's out there that we're talking to at this time. Unless the new Omicron variant decides to say, hold my beer, we're going to keep going with outreach events until we see what happens. And with that, I have Orion here saying, hey, he got a package. Oh, good. It's my new belt. It's not as good as I expected. And he's only going to give it 3 stars on his Amazon rating. So back to you, Doug.
Doug, you have a go.
Okay, thank you, David. 3 stars on the Amazon rating. Okay, all right. There's our last slide. Our next meeting will be on March 11th. We will be having Larry McHenry will be bringing us E.E. Barnard and his Dark Nebula. So thank you very much for attending this evening, and I hope that you can join us again next month. Thank you.